What would it feel like to wake up in a world where your future was already decided before you took your first breath, where every step you took, every word you spoke, and even the way you bowed your head carried consequences you could not escape? Feudal Japan is often remembered through polished images of samurai beneath cherry blossoms, elegant temples, and quiet gardens shaped with impossible care. But beneath that beauty lived a society built on rules so strict they shaped not only how people lived, but how they thought, feared, and endured. Tonight, imagine that you are not visiting this world as a traveler or historian, but opening your eyes within it. There is no option to leave, no modern comfort waiting on the other side of the story. You are born into a role that cannot be changed, into a system that values harmony over happiness and order over mercy. Life in feudal Japan was not a constant battlefield, but it was something far more exhausting. It was a daily performance, repeated from childhood to death, where one mistake could follow your family for generations. This was a land of extraordinary discipline. Cleanliness was not a preference but a moral duty. Silence was often safer than speech. Obedience was praised, curiosity discouraged, and individuality treated as a quiet threat. Even joy had its place and time, carefully regulated by season, status, and tradition. To modern eyes, it may appear graceful, even peaceful. To those who lived inside it, the pressure was constant and invisible, like a hand resting gently on the shoulder, never squeezing, but never leaving. Feudal Japan lasted for centuries, shifting through different eras and rulers, yet the structure of everyday life remained remarkably consistent. Samurai were bound by codes that demanded loyalty unto death. Peasants carried the weight of the economy in muddy rice fields, knowing hunger far better than comfort. Merchants counted coins they were never allowed to flaunt. Artisans perfected beauty while remaining socially invisible. And beneath them all existed those society relied upon but refused to acknowledge, people who lived close to death so others could pretend it did not exist. As we move slowly through this world, we will not rush from battle to battle or linger only on famous names. Instead, we will follow the quiet rhythm of daily life. We will wake with the sun, work until the body aches, eat simple meals under watchful eyes, and fall asleep knowing tomorrow will be exactly the same. Along the way, we will see where history is clear and where it blurs into legend, where later writers softened harsh realities, and where uncomfortable truths were hidden beneath silk and ceremony. This is not a story about whether feudal Japan was good or bad. It is a story about how it functioned, and what it demanded from those who lived within it. As the night settles in and the pace of thought begins to slow, allow yourself to drift into this distant world, not as a hero, but as an ordinary person trying to survive another day without drawing attention, without making mistakes, and without dictionarying anyone whose name you carry. And as that first day begins, long before breakfast or prayer, everything already feels decided. The first thing you would learn in feudal Japan, often without being told directly, is that the world is built like a staircase you are not meant to climb. Society was divided into rigid layers, and once you were placed on one, you stayed there for life. This was not a suggestion or a tradition that could bend with ambition. It was law, custom, and expectation fused together so tightly that even imagining another path could be dangerous. At the top stood the samurai, the warrior class. They carried swords, authority, and the heavy burden of honor. Beneath them were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population and produced the rice that fed everyone else. Below peasants came artisans, skilled workers who crafted tools, clothing, weapons, and art. At the bottom were merchants, people who often held money but lacked respect, because earning wealth through trade rather than physical labor was considered morally suspicious. In feudal Japan, usefulness did not equal status, and money did not equal power. Then there were those who barely existed in official records at all. The Eta and Heining, groups often described as untouchables. They worked as butchers, executioners, tanners, and gravediggers. Society relied on them to handle death and impurity, yet treated them as if they were contaminated by it. They lived on the edges of towns, married only among themselves, and were excluded from social life. Their labor was essential, but their presence was denied. It was a quiet cruelty, built directly into the structure of everyday life. What made this hierarchy especially suffocating was how strictly it was enforced. Changing your class was not simply difficult, it was illegal. A peasant dressing like a samurai could be punished. A merchant acting above their station risked public humiliation or worse. Even language reflected class. The way you spoke, bowed, and addressed others immediately revealed where you belonged. One misplaced gesture could expose you as arrogant, ignorant, or threatening. Ironically, the merchants, despite ranking lowest, often lived comfortably. As trade expanded, many accumulated wealth far beyond that of struggling samurai families. But they were expected to hide it. Displaying luxury invited resentment and suspicion. Successful merchant households mastered the art of appearing modest while living well behind closed doors, careful never to provoke the envy or boredom of armed men who ranked above them. Peasants lived with even less flexibility. Their lives revolved around rice production, not only as food, but as currency. Taxes were paid in rice, calculated carefully by local officials. A poor harvest did not mean lower taxes. It meant hunger. If peasants hid rice to survive, it could be treated as theft or rebellion. Entire villages could be punished for the actions of a few, reinforcing obedience through shared fear. This social order was justified through philosophy and religion. Confucian ideas emphasized harmony, duty, and knowing one's place. Buddhism offered acceptance of suffering as part of life. Shinto tied social roles to ancestral tradition. Together, they formed a worldview where questioning hierarchy felt unnatural, even dangerous. And so, from the moment you were born, your life followed a narrow path. Your clothes, your education, your speech, your future were all quietly determined. Ambition was not admired. It was feared. The safest way to survive was to remain invisible, to perform your role well, and to never forget where you stood. Because in feudal Japan, the greatest danger was not falling from power, but reaching for it in the first place. Mourning in feudal Japan did not begin with an alarm or a choice. It began with light, sound, and obligation. The sun rose, the village stirred, and your body moved because it had to. Sleeping late was not indulgent or rebellious. It was simply impossible. Homes were built to let the world in, not keep it out. Thin wooden walls, paper screens, and open spaces meant that cold, heat, insects, and noise arrived freely, whether you welcomed them or not. If you were a peasant, you likely woke on a straw mat laid directly on packed earth or wooden boards. The air was cool, sometimes damp, and often carried the smell of smoke from last night's fire. Animals were close, sometimes inside the house, sometimes just beyond it. Privacy was rare, and silence was brief. Children stirred, elders coughed, and the day demanded attention before your body felt ready to give it. Samurai households were more structured, but not necessarily more comfortable. Their homes were cleaner and more orderly, yet still unheated and exposed to the seasons. Rank did not bring softness. It brought expectation. A samurai rose early not because of farming, but because discipline required it. To sleep too long was to appear lazy. To appear lazy was to invite judgment. Cleanliness followed waking almost immediately. In feudal Japan, washing was not a luxury. It was a moral act. You rinsed your hands, face, and mouth with cold water drawn from a well or stream. In winter, this was a test of endurance. There was no warm tap, no negotiation with the temperature. The shock was part of the ritual, a reminder of self-control. Soap, if available, was made from ash or rice bran, practical and unscented. Bathing was communal and deeply ritualized. If your village had a bathhouse, it was a place of shared vulnerability. Men bathed with men, women with women, completely unclothed, pretending not to notice one another. The rule was simple and strict. You washed thoroughly before entering the tub. Dirtying the shared water was a serious social offense. Clean water was a symbol of harmony. To disrespect it was to disrespect everyone. For those without access to bathhouses, washing happened when possible, often in rivers or with limited water at home. Teeth were cleaned with salt or twigs. Hair was carefully maintained, especially for women and samurai, whose appearance reflected not personal style but discipline and respectability. Even after hard labor, cleanliness was expected. Dirt on the body suggested dirt in the spirit. Clothing was aired and brushed daily. Not because it was fashionable, but because smell and disorder were considered signs of moral failure. A samurai could be inspected by a superior at any time. Dirty nails, wrinkled robes, or unkempt hair could be interpreted as disrespect. For women, grooming was even more demanding. Hairstyles were elaborate, maintained with oils and pins, and could take hours to arrange, all before a full day of work. As the mourning continued, households shifted from ritual to labor. Tools were gathered. Rice fields awaited. Lessons began for those allowed to learn. There was little space between waking and working, little time for reflection. Life moved forward without asking how you felt about it. And as the sun climbed higher, the day settled into its familiar rhythm, one that would repeat itself with quiet precision for years, perhaps for an entire lifetime. When people imagine the samurai, they often picture dramatic duels, flashing blades, and heroic last stands. But for most samurai in feudal Japan, daily life was far quieter and far more mentally exhausting. Combat was rare. Discipline was constant. A samurai's true battlefield was not the open field, but the controlled space of etiquette, obedience, and self-restraint. From an early age, a samurai was trained to master both body and mind. Swordsmanship and archery were essential, but they were only part of the picture. A proper samurai was also expected to write elegant calligraphy, compose poetry, understand strategy, practice ceremony, and move with measured grace. Physical strength without refinement was considered crude. Refinement without loyalty was dangerous. At the center of samurai life stood Bushido, the way of the warrior. Contrary to popular belief, Bushido was not a single written rulebook followed uniformly across Japan. It was a collection of values that evolved over time, shaped by Confucian duty, Buddhist acceptance of death, and Shinto reverence for ancestors. Loyalty, self-control, and honor were its pillars. But these ideals were not comforting. They were unforgiving. A samurai did not live for himself. He lived for his lord, known as the daimyo. The daimyo's favor determined everything: income, reputation, safety, and survival. Obedience was expected without hesitation. Questioning orders, even silently, could be interpreted as disloyalty. The emotional weight of this relationship was immense. A lord's anger could ruin a family. His disappointment could end a lineage. Dishonor was the greatest fear. It was not a private feeling but a public stain. Speaking out of turn, failing in duty, or embarrassing one's lord could lead to severe consequences. In extreme cases, a disgraced samurai might be expected to perform seppuku, a ritual ending of one's own life, intended to restore honor through death. While later stories sometimes exaggerate how common this was, the expectation alone was enough to haunt daily existence. Even in moments of peace, samurai were never fully at ease. They carried swords at all times, not just as weapons, but as symbols of authority. Drawing a blade in public was a serious act, often implying deadly intent. Wearing swords incorrectly could itself be an insult. Every movement mattered. Every gesture was observed. Samurai households were not places of loud laughter or casual comfort. Emotions were carefully contained. Public displays of fear, anger, or grief were seen as weakness. Even joy was moderated. A samurai was expected to remain composed under all circumstances, projecting calm even when under intense pressure. Ironically, many samurai lived modestly, even poorly. As peace settled over Japan during long periods of stability, many warriors found themselves without battles to fight and with stipends that failed to keep up with rising costs. Some took on administrative roles. Others fell into debt, borrowing from merchants they officially outranked. The contradiction was sharp. Men trained to die for honor struggled to pay for rice. Yet despite the pressure, the identity of samurai remained powerful. It offered meaning in a world of rigid roles. To serve with loyalty, to endure hardship without complaint, and to meet fate with composure were seen as life's highest achievements. And so, beneath the polished armor and quiet discipline, samurai life unfolded as a constant balancing act between obedience and pride, fear and restraint, duty and the unspoken hope of surviving another day without failing. If you were not born into a samurai household, chances were overwhelming that you were born a peasant. Peasants made up the vast majority of feudal Japan's population, and their lives formed the quiet foundation upon which the entire society rested. Everything depended on their labor, yet very little was done to protect them from exhaustion, hunger, or loss. To be a peasant was not simply to work hard. It was to live in a state of permanent vulnerability. The rhythm of a peasant's life followed the agricultural calendar with little variation. Rice was the center of everything. It was food, currency, tax, and measurement of worth. Fields were flooded, drained, planted, and harvested according to the seasons, and every stage required backbreaking effort. Planting rice meant standing ankle-deep in mud for hours, bent forward, repeating the same motion until muscles burned and joints ached. There were no machines to ease the strain, only human bodies and simple tools. Days were long and physically punishing. Work began at sunrise and ended only when light faded. Breaks were brief, meals simple, and rest never guaranteed. Injury was common. Illness was dangerous. A twisted ankle or infected cut could threaten not just comfort, but survival. Medical care was limited to folk remedies, herbs, and prayer. Recovery meant time away from the fields, and time away from the fields meant falling behind. Taxes loomed over every harvest. Peasants did not pay in coins, but in rice, calculated carefully by officials who rarely accepted excuses. A bad harvest did not reduce what was owed. It simply meant less food left for the family. Hiding rice to survive could be treated as theft or rebellion. Entire villages could be punished collectively, reinforcing obedience through shared risk. Hunger was not an accident. It was a constant possibility built into the system. Movement was restricted. Peasants were often forbidden from leaving their villages without permission. Travel required approval. Life unfolded within a narrow geographic and social boundary. Generations lived and died on the same land, working the same fields, following the same routines. Dreams of change were not encouraged. They were irrelevant. Despite the hardship, village life was not entirely without moments of relief. Seasonal festivals offered brief escape. Music, dancing, and shared food allowed people to forget their burdens for a night or two. Sake flowed, laughter rose, and for a moment, the weight of obligation eased. But these moments were fleeting. The fields waited. The taxes returned. The cycle resumed. Peasant homes were modest, built from wood, straw, and earth. Comfort was minimal. Heat came from small fires that struggled against winter cold. Clothing was practical, often patched and reused. Yet there was pride in endurance. To survive was an achievement. To provide rice for the household was an act of quiet dignity. In feudal Japan, peasants were praised in theory as the backbone of society, yet treated in practice as expendable. Their labor sustained the classes above them, while their suffering remained largely invisible. They did not carry swords or write poetry, but their lives were defined by resilience. And as the seasons turned and the fields demanded more, the peasant majority continued their work, knowing that tomorrow would look much like today, and that survival itself was the measure of success. Food in feudal Japan was not a source of comfort or indulgence. It was fuel, carefully measured and quietly consumed. What you ate, how much you ate, and even how you ate it were shaped by class, season, and necessity. Hunger was familiar, and fullness was never guaranteed. For most people, rice was the center of every meal. It was eaten plain, sometimes mixed with barley or millet to stretch supplies. For peasants, rice was both sustenance and obligation. The best portion went to taxes, not to the household table. What remained had to last until the next harvest. A poor season could turn meals into thin porridge and hope into calculation. Every grain mattered. Vegetables supplemented the diet when available. Turnips, radishes, greens, and roots were common, often pickled to preserve them through winter. Protein was scarce. Meat was rarely eaten by common people, partly due to religious influence and partly due to cost. Fish was more common, but often dried, salted, or fermented. It was filling, but not gentle on the teeth or stomach. Samurai households ate better, but even there, abundance was limited. Meals were simple and restrained. Eating too much or showing desire for rich food was considered unrefined. A samurai often ate after his lord and guests, sometimes receiving food that had already cooled. Accepting this without complaint was a sign of humility and loyalty. Everything was seasonal. There was no refrigeration, no long-distance transport of fresh food. When something was out of season, it simply did not exist. Winter brought scarcity. Summer brought spoilage. Preservation was essential. Drying, salting, and pickling were survival skills passed down through generations. Food could also be dangerous. Illness from spoiled ingredients was common, and medical understanding was limited. Treatment often involved rest, herbal mixtures, and endurance. There were no guarantees. A simple stomach illness could become serious. In extreme cases, the body either recovered or did not. Stealing food was treated harshly. A missing bowl of rice was not a small crime. It was a challenge to order. Punishments were public and severe enough to discourage others. Survival and law were often in tension, and law usually won. Tea was widespread, but not casual. The tea ceremony, especially among the elite, was not about drinking. It was about posture, discipline, and humility. Every movement had meaning. Mistakes were remembered. Even in daily life, tea was taken quietly, without excess. Meals were eaten in silence or with minimal conversation. Gratitude was shown, not pleasure. Food was respected because it was hard-won. To complain was to reveal ignorance of hardship. And so, in feudal Japan, eating was an act of survival, shaped by restraint and awareness. Hunger was never far away, and every meal carried the quiet understanding that tomorrow's food was never guaranteed. In feudal Japan, words were never neutral. Speech carried weight, and weight could crush you if handled carelessly. Knowing when to speak, how to speak, and when to remain silent was not a social skill. It was a survival instinct. Hierarchy governed conversation just as strictly as it governed clothing or movement. Speaking to someone above your station required careful language, respectful tone, and precise posture. A single misplaced word could be interpreted as arrogance or defiance. Even among equals, caution ruled. Disagreement was dangerous. Correction was risky. Silence was often the safest response. Free expression, as understood today, did not exist. Opinions were not personal possessions. They were liabilities. Criticizing a superior, even gently, could invite punishment. Mockery or humor, if misunderstood, could be treated as disrespect. The safest humor was directed downward, never upward. Even then, restraint was advised. Apologies were formal rituals. Saying sorry was not enough. One bowed deeply, sometimes repeatedly, and might offer a gift to show sincerity. The language of apology was refined and indirect. Too casual, and it appeared insincere. Too dramatic, and it suggested guilt beyond the offense. Getting it wrong could worsen the situation. Within families, speech was equally regulated. Children did not interrupt parents. Wives did not publicly contradict husbands. Elders spoke, others listened. Respect flowed upward, obedience downward. These rules were learned early and reinforced constantly. For samurai, speech was part of training. Calm, measured words reflected inner discipline. Showing anger or fear through speech was considered weakness. A sharp tongue could provoke violence, forcing others to respond to restore honor. Silence prevented escalation. Written words carried similar risks. Letters were formal, carefully phrased, and often indirect. Poetry was a safe outlet, but even then, metaphor had rules. Too emotional, and it suggested instability. Too clever, and it hinted at arrogance. Rumors spread quietly, carried through villages and towns without names attached. Reputation was fragile. Once damaged, it was difficult to restore. A careless comment could follow a family for years. This culture of restraint created a society that appeared calm on the surface. Conflict rarely exploded openly. Instead, it simmered beneath politeness and ritual. People learned to read subtle cues, pauses, and expressions. Meaning was hidden in tone rather than volume. And so, in feudal Japan, survival often depended not on strength or skill, but on knowing when to remain silent, when to bow, and when to let your thoughts stay safely unspoken. In feudal Japan, clothing was never just clothing. It was a visible declaration of who you were, where you belonged, and how carefully you respected the invisible rules of society. Before you spoke a single word, your sleeves, colors, and posture had already introduced you. For samurai, dress was both privilege and responsibility. They wore layered robes made from fine fabrics, often silk, in subdued but dignified colors. Their clothing signaled readiness and authority. Most important of all were the paired swords, the long and short blades worn at the waist. These were not merely weapons. They were symbols of legal power. Wearing them incorrectly, touching them carelessly, or drawing one without cause could bring swift consequences. Peasants dressed for endurance, not elegance. Their clothing was made from coarse cotton or hemp, dyed in muted shades of brown, grey, or blue. Bright colors were expensive and impractical. Clothes were patched, reused, and passed down. Footwear was simple, often straw sandals that wore out quickly. Appearance mattered, but within limits. Looking too refined could invite suspicion. Looking too careless could invite scorn. Merchants occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. They often had money, sometimes more than samurai, but were expected to hide it. Their clothing was made from better materials, yet kept deliberately plain. Luxury was reserved for private spaces. Public display of wealth could provoke resentment or worse. Successful merchants learned to blend in while quietly thriving. Women's clothing followed especially strict rules. Kimono patterns, colors, and fabrics changed with the seasons and social status. Wearing the wrong motif at the wrong time could be seen as ignorance or disrespect. Dressing too boldly risked judgment. Dressing too modestly could signal low standing. Hairstyles were complex and time-consuming, maintained with oils and pins, and expected to remain neat throughout long days of work. Grooming was constant. Hair was brushed, clothes aired, and bodies kept clean not for comfort, but for social acceptance. Disorder suggested moral failure. Cleanliness reflected discipline. Even after physical labor, appearing presentable was expected. Artisans dressed neatly but practically. Their clothing reflected skill without drawing attention. To stand out unnecessarily was considered foolish. In feudal Japan, blending in was often safer than shining. Clothing enforced hierarchy without words. It reminded everyone of their place. It discouraged ambition and rewarded conformity. You could not dress your way into a new life. You could only confirm the one you had been given. And as people passed one another on narrow roads and village paths, they read these signals instinctively, adjusting their behavior before a word was spoken, because in this world, appearance was law and judgment was constant. In feudal Japan, love was not the foundation of marriage. Stability was. Relationships were shaped by family interests, social rank, and economic necessity long before personal feelings were considered. Romance existed, but it lived quietly, often hidden beneath obligation and silence. For peasants, marriage was practical. Families arranged matches to combine labor, secure land, and ensure survival. Compatibility meant physical health and willingness to work. Affection, if it grew, came later, shaped by shared hardship rather than passion. Refusing an arranged marriage was rare and risky, as it could damage family standing within the village. Among samurai families, marriage was a political tool. Matches were arranged to strengthen alliances, secure loyalty, or settle disputes between clans. A daughter's marriage could shift power. Her feelings were secondary. A samurai wife was expected to manage the household, bear children, and represent her husband's family with flawless etiquette. Emotional restraint was a virtue. Women across all classes had limited autonomy. Marriage often occurred young, especially among elite families. Education for women focused on domestic skills, obedience, and grace. Public expression of desire was discouraged. Silence was protection. Extramarital relationships existed, but they carried serious risk. Adultery could result in public shame, exile, or death, depending on class and circumstance. For men of higher rank, taking concubines was relatively common, especially when heirs were needed. For women, the same behavior could be disastrous. Love letters and secret meetings appear frequently in literature and theater, often ending in tragedy. These stories reflect longing, not reality. They offered emotional release in a society where personal desire was tightly controlled. Intimacy was shaped by duty rather than romance. Affection was often expressed through action, providing food, protection, or stability rather than words. Public displays of emotion were rare. Despite the constraints, people still fell in love. Quietly, briefly, often with the wrong person. These feelings were not forbidden, but they were dangerous, because they conflicted with expectation. And so, in feudal Japan, love existed in the margins, whispered in poetry and glances, while marriage marched forward as an obligation, reminding everyone that personal happiness was never the primary goal. In feudal Japan, Death was not a distant concept waiting quietly at the end of life. It was present, familiar, and woven into daily awareness. People did not speak of it often, but they lived with the understanding that life was fragile, easily disrupted by illness, accident, violence, or nature itself. Preparing for death, emotionally and spiritually, was considered part of being disciplined. For peasants, death often arrived through hunger, disease, or exhaustion. Medical knowledge was limited, and access to care was uneven. A fever, an infected wound, or complications during childbirth could quickly turn fatal. Remedies consisted of herbal mixtures, prayer, and rest. There were no guarantees, and survival was often left to endurance and luck. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Midwives relied on experience rather than science, and complications could claim both mother and child. Families accepted this risk quietly, believing that fate and spiritual balance played a role in all outcomes. Travel brought its own dangers. Roads were poorly maintained and often unsafe. Bandits operated beyond the protection of towns. Most people avoided travel unless absolutely necessary. To leave one's village was to expose oneself to uncertainty. Samurai lived under a different shadow. They were trained to accept death calmly and without hesitation. Ritual ending of one's own life was seen, in extreme circumstances, as a way to preserve honor. While later stories sometimes exaggerate its frequency, the expectation alone shaped behavior. Knowing that failure could lead to such an end placed constant pressure on conduct. Public executions existed, serving as warnings rather than spectacles. Justice was swift and often harsh. Punishment reinforced order, not mercy. Nature itself was a threat. Earthquakes, floods, fires, droughts, and storms struck without warning. Homes collapsed. Crops failed. Entire communities could be wiped out. There was no centralized relief. Rebuilding was expected. Acceptance was taught. Death rituals emphasized calm dignity. Loud displays of grief were discouraged. Composure honored both the living and the dead. Poetry was sometimes composed before death, not as drama, but as reflection. In feudal Japan, mortality shaped perspective. Life was valued not for its length, but for how correctly it was lived. And so, death remained close, not feared openly, but respected as an inevitable companion walking quietly beside every living person. In feudal Japan, the idea of the individual mattered far less than the idea of the group. A person was not seen as a separate, self-directed being, but as a living extension of their family, their ancestors, and their clan. Identity flowed downward through bloodlines, and with it came responsibility, expectation, and risk. You did not simply live your own life. You carried the weight of many lives that came before you, and the consequences of your actions could stretch far beyond you. From birth, your name tied you to a larger whole. Your behavior reflected not only on yourself, but on your parents, your siblings, and even relatives you might never meet. Honor and shame were collective experiences. A single mistake could stain an entire household. A single disgrace could echo across generations. This awareness shaped every decision, every hesitation, every carefully measured word. Clans functioned as units of survival and control. Loyalty to the family was absolute. Personal desires were expected to bend to collective needs. If your clan needed an alliance, you married accordingly. If your family specialized in farming, crafting, or military service, that path became yours as well. Personal ambition that conflicted with family interest was not admirable. It was selfish. For samurai families, this pressure was even heavier. Honor was inherited as much as it was earned. A samurai's conduct could elevate or destroy the reputation of an entire lineage. If a member brought shame, others might suffer consequences. In extreme cases, relatives could be pressured to take responsibility through sacrifice or punishment, not for what they had done, but for what someone else had failed to do correctly. Peasant families experienced this differently but no less intensely. Survival depended on cooperation. Fields were worked together. Taxes were paid collectively. If one household fell behind, the village might intervene, sometimes harshly, to protect itself. Harmony was enforced because conflict threatened everyone. The concept of personal freedom, as understood today, did not exist in this system. Choice was limited, and deviation carried risk. Even expressing a desire that did not align with family expectations could create tension or suspicion. The safest path was obedience, not just to authority, but to tradition itself. Children were raised to understand this early. They learned that their actions were never theirs alone. Pride was communal. Shame was shared. Responsibility extended outward in all directions. And so, in feudal Japan, survival often meant surrendering the self. To live correctly was to blend into the larger structure, to move in rhythm with family and clan, and to accept that one's life was not owned, but entrusted, carried carefully in the shadow of those who came before. In feudal Japan, knowledge was never neutral. What you were allowed to learn, how deeply you could study it, and whether learning was encouraged at all depended entirely on your place in society. Education was not about personal growth or curiosity. It was about preparing you to perform your role correctly, without questioning the structure that placed you there. Samurai children received the most formal education. From a young age, they were taught reading and writing, classical texts, moral philosophy, and history. Calligraphy was essential, not only as communication but as a reflection of discipline. A steady brush showed a steady mind. Poetry was practiced to cultivate emotional control and aesthetic awareness. At the same time, martial training never stopped. Education was meant to produce loyal administrators and disciplined warriors, not independent thinkers. Merchant and artisan families focused on practical knowledge. Mathematics, accounting, and basic literacy were taught as tools for business and craft. Learning was useful, not philosophical. Reading served trade. Writing served contracts. Anything beyond that was unnecessary, and sometimes discouraged, as excessive education could invite suspicion. For peasants, education was minimal. Most children learned by working alongside their parents. Farming techniques, seasonal rhythms, and survival skills were passed down through demonstration rather than books. Literacy was rare. Many peasants would live their entire lives without reading a single text. Knowledge existed, but it was embodied, not written. Girls across all classes faced additional limitations. While daughters of samurai families might learn calligraphy, music, or poetry, this education was designed to make them refined wives, not leaders. Domestic skills were prioritized. Silence, grace, and obedience were considered forms of wisdom. Culture in feudal Japan was highly ritualized. Tea ceremonies, flower arrangement, theater, and seasonal festivals were governed by strict rules. These practices were not casual hobbies. They were performances of discipline. Every movement had meaning. Mistakes were remembered. Refinement was judged. Art was not about expression. It was about control. A poem revealed character. A painting showed restraint. A ceremony demonstrated inner order. Those who mastered culture gained quiet respect. Those who failed appeared unfit. By limiting access to education and shaping culture around conformity, feudal Japan maintained stability. Knowledge reinforced hierarchy. Art reinforced discipline. Learning taught people not how to change the world, but how to exist correctly within it. And so, even beauty served order, quietly guiding people back into their assigned roles, where questioning was unnecessary and understanding meant acceptance. Feudal Japan was shaped as much by nature as by human rule. The land was beautiful, fertile, and deeply unforgiving. Mountains, rivers, and coastlines defined where people lived and how they survived, but the same forces that sustained life could destroy it without warning. Nature was not a backdrop. It was an active presence, unpredictable and powerful. Earthquakes were a constant threat. The ground could shake violently at any moment, collapsing homes built from wood and paper. Fires often followed, spreading quickly through tightly packed towns. There were no alarms, no emergency plans. When disaster struck, survival depended on instinct and luck. Rebuilding was expected. Grief was contained. Floods and typhoons regularly devastated farmland. Too much rain could wash away crops. Too little could dry the fields into useless soil. Farmers watched the sky carefully, knowing their survival rested on forces beyond control. Prayers and rituals sought balance, but results were uncertain. Winters were harsh, especially for those without resources. Heating was minimal. Thin walls offered little protection. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. Cold settled into bones. Illness followed. Volcanic eruptions added another layer of danger. Ash could bury villages and ruin harvests. Entire regions might become uninhabitable for years. There was no evacuation system, no compensation. People endured or moved if allowed. Despite this, endurance became a cultural value. Complaining about nature was seen as pointless. Acceptance was strength. Survival was proof of discipline. In feudal Japan, living meant adapting continuously, knowing that neither rulers nor rituals could fully protect against the land itself. Nature reminded everyone that control was always limited. As the day in feudal Japan draws to a close, the quiet settles in again, not as rest, but as routine. Lamps are lit softly. Doors are slid shut. Bodies lower themselves onto thin mats, already tired in ways that feel permanent. Tomorrow will come early, and it will demand the same obedience, the same endurance, the same careful attention to invisible rules. Nothing about this is dramatic. That is precisely the point. Feudal Japan was not designed to make people comfortable. It was designed to make society stable. Beauty, ritual, and discipline were not luxuries. They were tools. They shaped behavior, softened conflict, and kept millions of people moving in predictable patterns. The cost of that stability was personal freedom. Choice was rare. Individual desire was secondary. Survival depended on conformity. From the outside, it is easy to admire the elegance, the architecture, the poetry, the rituals perfected over generations. But living inside that system meant constant awareness of rank, of expectation, of consequence. A misplaced word, a wrong gesture, a forgotten rule. Each carried weight. Each could alter a life. And yet, people lived. They worked. They loved quietly. They endured hunger, disaster, and fear with a composure that was learned, not natural. Children grew into roles without questioning them. Elders carried knowledge shaped by acceptance. Life continued not because it was easy, but because there was no alternative. It is tempting to romanticize the past, to imagine ourselves thriving beneath cherry blossoms and paper lanterns. But survival in feudal Japan required restraint more than courage, silence more than strength, obedience more than ambition. Most modern lives are built around choice. Feudal lives were built around limits. As you rest now, far removed from that world, there is something quietly valuable in remembering it. Not to judge it, not to envy it, but to understand how rare comfort and freedom truly are in human history. For most people, for most of time, life has been about enduring what cannot be changed. And perhaps that is the final lesson feudal Japan leaves behind. That beauty can exist alongside hardship. That order can demand sacrifice. And that beneath layers of tradition and control, ordinary people lived one careful day at a time, just as the night closes in and the world grows still.